It was the 14th of November, 1965, in the central highlands of Vietnam, under a mountain that stood across the Cambodian border. At 48 minutes past 10 in the morning, 16 helicopters came down into the elephant grass at its foot, and the men who stepped off them stepped into grass that closed over their shoulders. Then the ships lifted again and turned east for the next lift, and the sound of them thinned and was gone. What was left in that clearing was something under 100 men. Above them stood the mountain, and what was on the mountain nobody had counted yet. Over the next 4 days, on that clearing and on another one to the north, the United States Army and the North Vietnamese Army fought each other for the first time. 2 regular armies in the open, with nothing between them but grass. Both sides walked out of the valley believing they had learned how to beat the other. Both were partly right. Almost everything that happened in the 10 years afterward was built on what the two of them decided in those 4 days. This is the complete story of the Ia Drang, from the first helicopter down in the grass to the last man brought home. Before we settle in for the night, if long, quiet history like this is what helps you rest, a like or a subscription helps. The Long Watch find other people who fall asleep to the past. Videos like this one take weeks to research and to build, and that one small click genuinely keeps the watch going. Now, get comfortable, let the grass go quiet, and let's go back to the beginning. In the middle of South Vietnam, a long way from the coast and from the war the world was watching, lies the country the maps call the Central Highlands. The Annamite chain makes it the mountain spine that runs the length of Vietnam. And where those mountains widen, they lift the land into a plateau shaped like a crescent, roughly 400 kilometers long and 160 across. In 1965, it was one of the emptiest places in the country. It was also one of the most important. Up close, the highlands are 2 kinds of ground. The mountains that frame the plateau are steep, with jagged ridgelines and narrow valleys folded between them, their slopes under dense forest. The plateau itself is easier country, though only by comparison. Heavy timber, trees 30 meters tall, and where the forest thins, brush and elephant grass grown to a man's shoulder, so that walking through it you can see the sky and the crowns of the trees, and almost nothing else. Across all of it ran 2 roads worth the name, and they crossed at a town called Pleiku. One came down the length of the plateau from the north. The other, Highway 19, climbed from the port at Quy Nhon through the An Khê Pass and ran west past Pleiku toward the Cambodian border. Photographs of that climb carry a caption from the period: the gateway to the Central Highlands. Southwest of Pleiku, one mountain stood over everything, a huge irregular mass called Chu Pong, its peaks more than 700 meters above the plain. It sat astride the border itself, from its western edge in Cambodia to its eastern foot inside South Vietnam, measured about 13 kilometers, 8 miles. Along its northern side ran a river, flowing northwest, and the river was called the Ia Drang. In the language of the Jarai people, Ia means water, a river. The rest is only a name. Almost nobody lived in the Western Highlands in any way the war could use. 14 Special Forces camps stood along the inland frontier, each a compound of wire and sandbags with a dirt strip beside it, and there were the provincial capitals. Beyond those, the Army's own history says, friendly positions were few and far between, and over the plateau hung the question the same history could not answer: whether an army could stay there at all. General William Westmoreland, commanding all American forces in Vietnam, had long understood what rode on the answer. Whoever held the plateau held the high ground in the middle of the country and could strike north or south as he chose, or turn east and come down toward the lowlands and the sea, and cut South Vietnam in two. That fear was old enough to be written into plans. An American contingency designed from 1964 had already put the main force along the axis from Pleiku to Quy Nhon, a line drawn before anyone had heard the words Ia Drang. Knowing where the danger lay did not settle where to put the Americans. And through the summer of 1965, that argument ran hot. Admiral Ulysses Sharp, the theater commander in the Pacific, and General John McConnell, the Air Force Chief of Staff, both thought Pleiku a poor place for a division, too far inland, everything arriving by air, along a supply line that could not be relied on indefinitely. The base, they said, would not hold. Behind the objection stood a memory every officer in the room shared. 11 years earlier, the French had put a garrison into a remote valley called Dien Bien Phu, supplied only through the air, and lost both the valley and the war. One American general later put the objection bluntly. Admiral Sharp had a Dien Bien Phu syndrome and did not want the 1st Cavalry Division far inland. Westmoreland wanted it in the Highlands anyway, and compromised on the map. An Cay, on Highway 19, halfway between the harbor at Quy Nhon and the plateau at Pleiku, near enough to the sea for one camp, near enough to the mountains for the other. The root of all of it is a date. In 1954, France gave up Indochina and agreed to divide Vietnam at the 17th parallel, and the United States began building up the South. Hanoi worked from a plan in 3 stages: build the bases and the political organization, unsettle the government with small attacks, then large operations to finish it. It moved faster than the plan. In 1960, American estimates put the insurgency at 4,000 men. 3 years later, the figure was 35,000, and the main force units were carrying Chinese copies of the Soviet AK-47. Then, on the morning of the 7th of February 1965, sappers and mortars struck the American barracks and airfield at Pleiku. 9 Americans killed, more than 100 wounded, 21 aircraft destroyed. The bombing of the North began that month. Even so, there were still no American ground units on the plateau, only some 1,300 Special Forces soldiers on the inland frontier, and 4 battalions of Army aviation, including the new UH-1 Iroquois, the machine everyone already called the Huey. Their formula was still to advise and support, not to replace. In those years, the sound of a helicopter over the plateau was the sound of the South Vietnamese Army with American instructors aboard, and villagers who heard it coming went to ground. By the end of October 1965, they had stopped bothering. By then, the formula had broken, and the plan on the other side was already old. Hanoi had begun moving toward the Highlands in the middle of 1964, a year and a half before the first American infantrymen set foot in the Ia Drang Valley. A North Vietnamese division was started south for the plateau, and then parceled out among other fronts, but the design outlived the division. The regiments came instead, one at a time, on foot. The 32nd at the turn of 1965, the 33rd by that October, the 66th at the beginning of November. They came down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is best understood not as a line on a map, but as a column of people in motion, always a little ahead of schedule, or a little behind. In the middle of November 1965, the command in the Highlands was still waiting on 2 units it had ordered forward, a battalion of heavy mortars and a battalion of twin anti-aircraft guns. Both were still walking somewhere in Cambodia. Neither would arrive in time. So that was the shape of the country in the autumn of 1965. A plateau with 2 roads across it, a mountain standing in the border, a river along its northern foot, and behind the mountain a sanctuary no Allied soldier could enter, a door into the middle of South Vietnam that nobody had ever locked. What was about to come through it was something no army had tried before. The division that came through that door was, in November of 1965, 4 years old as an idea and 4 months old as a unit. Its beginnings are not in Vietnam at all. They are in a conference room in Washington in the autumn of 1961, where the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, told 3 Army officers that the service was buying its helicopters too slowly. The study he asked for came back cautious, and in April of 1962, he wrote again, in a memorandum the Army has been quoting ever since. The program, he said, was dangerously conservative. McNamara wanted something else. He would be disappointed, he wrote, if the re-examination merely produced recommendations to procure more of the same, rather than a plan for fresh and perhaps unorthodox concepts that would give a significant increase in mobility. Then, in what the Army's own history calls a most unusual departure from accepted procedure, the Secretary named the men he wanted for the work. At the head of the list was Lieutenant General Hamilton Hose. Housey had his board running before the directive appointing him ever reached his desk. 13 generals and 5 civilians sat on it, and 3,000 soldiers took part in its tests. The report went in 90 days after the work began, and it ran to 3,500 pages. Its central proposal was a formation that had never existed, the Air Assault Division. On paper, the arithmetic was startling. Where an ordinary division of that day held about 100 aircraft, this one would have 459, and it would give up 2/3 of its ground vehicles to pay for them. Housey put the whole of it into a single sentence. The board, he said, had only one general conclusion. Adoption by the Army of the airmobile concept, however imperfectly it may be described and justified in this report, is necessary and desirable. In some respects, the transition is inevitable, just as was that from animal mobility to motor. Being right did not make the report welcome. Through that autumn, it looked as though the work would be studied to death and handed to the historians. It survived, and in February of 1963, the idea was given a cadre and a home at Fort Benning, Georgia. They called it the 11th Air Assault Division, in test status, and at the start it was almost nothing. 1 infantry battalion, a few officers on a staff, 3,000 men in all, and 150-odd aircraft. One detail from that first year explains the size of the task better than any table of organization. When the division was formed, Army regulations effectively forbade helicopters to fly in formation, except under the most unusual circumstances. Everything the division existed for had to be built outward from that starting line. An infantryman learning a different way of entering a fight, an artilleryman learning to give familiar support with guns that arrived slung beneath aircraft. The test report went in on the 1st of December 1964, closing out 21 months of nearly feverish work. 3 months later came the preliminary decision to make the thing real, and on the 1st of July 1965, the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, was activated. New work under old colors, borrowed from a division then standing in Korea. Then it had 90 days. Almost half the men on hand were ineligible for overseas deployment, and the transfers that fixed that hollowed the division out and refilled it at once. What finally sailed was a division of nearly 16,000 men, over 400 aircraft, and 1,600 vehicles. The carrier Boxer went east by way of Suez. 3 transports went west across the Pacific. The official history puts it flatly: the division did not land ready to fight. Ahead of the ships, 1,000 men of an advance party had already flown in. The officer leading them, Brigadier General John Wright, arrived at the end of August with a base camp to build and no template for building it. His plan broke the rules. Rather than spread the camp out, folded into a compact rectangle a small number of men could defend, the division commander turned it down flat. Dispersal was doctrine and ordered nothing done until he arrived. Wright met him with boards and a great deal of chalk and talked him around. The heart of the camp was a helicopter field cleared out of semi-jungle by hand, 2 kilometers by 3, and for a while the largest helipad in the world. Its problem was dust. Red Highland dust, lifted by rotor wash, ate the leading edges of rotor blades. So Wright had grass planted across the cleared ground, on the reasoning that every blade of it would hold a little dust down. He forbade the men working there to scuff their boots on bare soil, and told them anyone caught at it would finish the job barefoot. The field, he instructed, was to look exactly like a good golf course. The name stuck. By autumn, the machine was working, and it worked in a fixed sequence. Tube artillery came down on the landing ground first. Time to the approach of the leading element. Right behind the shells came the aerial rocket artillery. 30 seconds of work and half its load. Then away to orbit and wait for a call. Behind that, the armed escort helicopters, and last and lowest, the transport Hueys with the infantry aboard. The hard part was not the flying. It was that the sky had grown crowded. Hundreds of transports, gunships, scout aircraft and fighters over the same few square kilometers, with thousands of artillery shells passing through that air on their way down. The division answered with zones laid over each firing position like the face of a clock, north at 12. Before shooting, gunners announced the dangerous sectors on the aviation emergency frequencies, firing in zones 3 and 4. Altitude 3,000 feet, and there were limits, which the Highlands taught early. There were no roads at all near the Chu Pong Massif, so the guns had to fly too, lifted onto bare hilltops within reach of the infantry. And the Highland air itself took something out of an engine, so that a machine which lifted a full load at sea level did not lift one here. The division owned over 400 helicopters and could not fly all of them. Spare parts were short, and a good many sat on the ground waiting for them. Fuel nearly stopped the campaign before it started. Every landing and every artillery move burned jet fuel in quantities nobody had planned for, and in late October, the division commander asked the Air Force for help. Within a day, the fuel situation in the Highlands was being reported to Saigon as critical. Enough fuel left to bring the troops in from the field, and no more. Delivery became the Air Force's first priority in the country, and even so, on some evenings, Pleiku ran dry. Had the pace held much longer, the division commander admitted afterward, his ground crews would not have kept up. It was often said, and not without truth, that the Army refused to admit the price that has to be paid for air mobility. The camp at An got its formal name a few months later, Camp Radcliffe, for Major Donald Radcliffe, one of the first men of the division killed in Vietnam. That is usually the order of these things. A place is built and then named backward, after somebody the men who built it had not lost yet. In September of 1965, the golf course was still only planted grass and red dust, and the men who would fly into the Ia Drang Valley 8 weeks later were, most of them, still working out where they were. An army that has learned to fly is still an army of people. By the second week of November 1965, the men who would meet in the valley of the Ia Drang were already moving toward it from opposite ends of the same map, and neither side knew a single name on the other. One army was walking there, and had been for months. The other would arrive in an hour by helicopter. The Americans carried a name they had inherited. On the 9th of November, the brigade working the Highlands was relieved by the 3rd Brigade of the 1st Cavalry Division, the Gary Owen Brigade. Gary Owen was an Irish quick-step once sung by Irish Lancers, adopted by the 7th Cavalry Regiment of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer during the Indian Wars of the 19th century. It came to Vietnam with the brigade, and the men who wore the name took no small pride in it. The brigade held the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 7th Cavalry, with the 2nd of the 5th attached. In his own regiment, the commander of the 1st Battalion had exactly one brother battalion behind him. He was Lieutenant Colonel Harold G. Moore, 43 years old, and the official history describes him in 4 words: the tall Kentuckian. West Point, class of 1945. Airborne infantry in occupied Japan, the 82nd at Fort Bragg, and a company in combat in Korea. The most revealing thing he ever wrote about the battle is its first line, "And it has nothing to do with fighting. During this operation, I was the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry." On November 23, 1965, I was promoted and turned over the battalion to my successor. The report is dated the 9th of December. The man writing 23 pages about those days no longer had the battalion he was writing about. What he put in those pages is the clearest portrait of him that exists. And the line that says the most about him is about sergeants rather than about fighting. They should not wear the chevrons of their grade in the field. Within the small units, all men know their leaders. Beside him stood the battalion sergeant major, Basil Plumley, who had come up through the 82nd Airborne in the Second World War, and through Korea after that. By that November, he had been a soldier for 25 years, and the men called him Old Iron Jaw. The operational records never mention him at all. He was a man of 3 wars, standing beside a commander who had fought in 2. The battalion would go into the valley on borrowed wings, and the officer who owned them was Major Bruce Crandall of the 229th Assault Helicopter Battalion. Not one of the pilots, but the man who ran the lift company and took his orders standing among the rifle company commanders. He was 32, and his call sign was Ancient Serpent 6. His wingman was Captain Ed Freeman, 37 and 6 feet 4 inches tall, which is where the nickname Too Tall came from. There was also a reporter. Joe Galloway of United Press International was 24 that November, and he remains the only reporter of the entire war decorated for valor. The only way to reach the battalion was by helicopter, and when his request went up the radio net, the answer came back in a single sentence: "If he's crazy enough to want to come in here and you've got room, bring him." In the sister battalion, there was a platoon leader who had come further to get there than anyone. Cyril Richard Rescorla, Rick, was born in Haley, on the southwestern tip of Cornwall, where American troops waited out the last months before Normandy. British Army in 1957, and parachute training. 3 years as a police inspector in northern Rhodesia, then a room in a Brooklyn YMCA, while he waited to enlist in somebody else's army. He was 26, and in the official account of the battle, he appears once under his full name. Moore's rifle companies went in at roughly 2/3 of their authorized strength, and the reason sits in one line of his report. The shortages were due primarily to malaria and to discharges at the expiration of a man's term of service. Soldiers went home on the date the paperwork gave them, in the middle of a campaign, and nobody came to take their place. 12 months was the tour, and it ran on the calendar rather than on the situation. The officers were another matter. 20 of the 23 authorized, nearly all with the battalion since the air assault trials at Fort Benning, where they had argued these tactics into existence on a Georgia training reservation. What the helicopter had taken from all of them was the slow approach to battle. A man could be playing volleyball in a base camp when the call came, and be in a heavy fight an hour later. The other army was not delivered anywhere. It walked. The 3 North Vietnamese regiments in the Highlands that autumn. The ones American records numbered the 32nd, the 33rd, and the 66th, had come down the trail in files about 9 miles in a day, which was the distance from one rest station to the next. The most respectful description of that soldier in any American document was written by the officer who fought him. He appeared to be well trained, Moore wrote. He was aggressive, his weapons were well maintained, and he carried plenty of ammunition. 3 to 5 Chinese stick grenades, a ball of cooked rice about the size of a softball, and a bedroll of waterproof plastic and a hammock. Empty his pack and you have his entire household. Shelter, bed, and dinner. He was an expert at camouflage, the report goes on, and used every bit of cover and concealment to perfection. He was a deadly shot. Then Moore turns the observation around on his own men. The American soldier must become at least as good as the North Vietnamese at camouflage and at the use of terrain. In the North, camouflage was taught as a subject of its own. Those soldiers had been sent south by a headquarters called the Western Highlands Field Front, and the man who ran it was Major General Chu Hui Man. 52 years old, born to a poor family in Oeon Province, in the revolutionary movement since he was 16, and planning a campaign meant to run from September into the following spring and end with the provincial capital in his hands. His deputy was a lieutenant colonel named Nguyen Hu An, and he was the man who would fight a battle on the ground. Born in 1926 in Ninh Binh, he joined the Viet Minh in September 1945. At Dien Bien Phu, at the age of 28, he commanded the 174th Regiment of the 316th Division in the long fight for the hill. The Vietnamese called A1 and the French called Elian II. His regiment went at it 3 times. On the morning of the 7th of May 1954, the hill was his. So there were 2 lieutenant colonels. One was 43, a West Point man who had commanded a company in Korea. The other was 39 and had taken Elian II. They held the same rank in the same profession, and until that November neither had ever seen the other's army in the field. By the middle of the month, the 3 regiments lay along the Ia Drang in the shadow of the Massif. The 32nd was still a formidable force. The 66th was the newest and strongest, its battalions arriving at or near full strength, straight from the north. None of these men had chosen the valley. It was chosen for them by a campaign that had begun a month earlier and well to the east of it, at a small camp with a dirt airstrip and a garrison of montagnards on the evening of the 19th of October. The camp at Plei Me stood about 45 kilometers southwest of Pleiku, an earth-walled triangle around a dirt strip, held by montagnard soldiers and a handful of advisors. That October it became the most important ground in the Highlands, and not because anyone especially wanted it. The plan that opened the campaign was not, in the first place, a plan to take a camp. It was a plan to make somebody come and rescue one. The design had 3 phases. The 33rd Regiment would surround Plei Me and press it hard enough that the South Vietnamese would have to send a relief column overland. The 32nd would already be waiting on Route 6C, the only road such a column could use. Then the 2 regiments would come together and finish the camp. Chu Hui Man had chosen the place with care. His opponent had no choice but to fight for anything critical to the defense of a provincial capital. Inside the wire that autumn were 12 American advisors, 14 South Vietnamese Special Forces soldiers, and a montagnard force of more than 400. And not all of them were at home. 85 montagnards and 2 of the Americans were out on an operation 15 kilometers to the northwest, and another 40 sat on 2 listening posts a couple of kilometers out in the dark. It began about 7 in the evening on the 19th of October, with fire on a montagnard patrol. By midnight there had been an assault from the north and northwest, and an hour after that a second from the south and east that got through the wire and was thrown back out of it. After that the siege found its rhythm, 1 battalion resting while the others kept up fire, day after day. The advisors called for aircraft and got them. The first strikes about 4 in the morning on the 20th, and more than 100 in the 26 hours that followed. The camp held, and the South Vietnamese commander asked for reinforcements, which was precisely what the plan required him to do. Assembling a proper relief column would take days, and nobody was sure the camp had days. Colonel William McKean, who commanded the Special Forces Group, proposed dropping parachutists directly into it. The senior American advisor at Corps headquarters refused, and the compromise was to put a force down by helicopter nearby and walk it in. 175 men, most of them South Vietnamese Rangers, under a major named Charles Beckwith. They came down on the 21st about 5 kilometers northeast of the camp and worked their way to the edge of it by nightfall. There Beckwith stopped. In the dark, the men inside would have no way of telling his people from the people attacking them. They waited out the night in the open, and at first light he told them to run like hell to the gates. It worked. Inside, he was the senior officer present and took command. Almost at once McKean ordered him back out. Get outside the camp. Rummage around. Clear the enemy out of there. Beckwith obeyed against his own judgment and sent 2 South Vietnamese companies beyond the wire. 14 men were lost quickly, one of them an advisor. His summary of that morning survives in the official history. We were all beginning to realize that we would be damn fortunate to get out of this camp alive. The column, meanwhile, was being argued over in Pleiku. Everyone expected an ambush, and the Corps commander, General Vin Loc, suspected the whole affair was a device to draw his forces out of the city and leave it open. On the 22nd, General Larson cut the knot. American troops would guarantee Pleiku if the reserves went to Play Me. The column grew to about 1,400 men. It moved on the 23rd, and by 5 in the afternoon it was feeling its way into the ground where the ambush was expected. Armored carriers and tanks in front, infantry on the flanks, the supply trucks a couple of kilometers behind. At 6, the fire came. The armor spread to either side of the road and shot back. Fighter bombers arrived, and helicopter gunships joined them. After 2 hours, the attack broke off. The rear of the column, with less to protect it, had the worst time of it. By morning, it was clear the ambush had failed. The 32nd had lost heavily, and against an opponent who could call down that much fire indefinitely, its commander took the regiment back to its base north of the Ia Drang, near the Cambodian border. The hook had been set in exactly the right place. What swam onto it was a different animal from the one the plan had imagined. The column then sat still for 2 days. Its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Trong Luat, would not go on until he was resupplied. He expected a second ambush and was finally moved by a promise of American artillery. He started again at 1 in the afternoon on the 25th and reached the camp by dusk, meeting nothing but harassing fire. An American observer rode the lead vehicle the whole way, walking artillery down the road ahead of the wheels. The delay turned out to be a gift. It gave the cavalry time to shift its guns into positions from which they could support whatever came next. By that same 25th of October, the 33rd Regiment was finished as a regiment. It had gone into the fight some 2,200 strong. By different accounts, it came out having lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of its men, and what remained was folded into a single composite battalion. Chu Hui Man moved his tactical headquarters to the north bank of the Ia Drang, hard against the Cambodian border, and waited for the fresh regiment walking toward him from the north. On the American side, the question was whether to call the Highlands finished and turn to the coast, or go after the regiments. General Kinnard wanted to pursue, and wanted the freedom to do it his own way. On the 28th of October, Westmoreland decided in his favor, and the division stopped reacting and began hunting. On the 1st of November, scout helicopters found men in the scrub some 11 kilometers southwest of Play Me, and the riflemen who landed to look found people who stood and fought instead of vanishing into the trees. They were guarding the field hospital of the 33rd Regiment. It was taken with its equipment, its medicines, and its stores, and among the papers was a map marked with march routes and supply routes. That map turned the division west, toward the border. 2 nights later, rifle platoons landed at a clearing just north of the Massif and laid 3 ambushes across the trails. At 7:30, a column came up out of the west, walking east, talking as it went, entirely certain the trail was safe. 100 meters short of the ambush, it halted to eat, then came on. Before morning, the Americans on that ground were themselves attacked, and reinforcements were flown into a perimeter in darkness. For the first time in the war, the dead belonged to the 8th Battalion of the 66th Regiment, the new one. By the second week of November, the 1st Brigade was spent, and control passed on the 9th to the brigade of Colonel Thomas Brown. 3 more days of searching turned up almost nothing. Kinnard ordered the hunt moved west, toward the border, and Brown settled on the thick country south of the Ia Drang at the foot of the Massif, a base area of the Viet Minh in the French War, marked on his intelligence map with a large red star. His operations officer cut 3 new search areas out of the map west of Play Me, stepping toward Cambodia. The brigade had been naming such areas by color and had used up the ordinary ones. So, tracing about 15 square kilometers with a grease pencil, he named the last of them for the shape it made, a painter's palette, lime. It reached into the massif itself, and the battalion given it was Moors. On the 10th of November, undiscouraged by what Play Me had cost him, Chu Hui Man decided to try the camp again on the 16th. The assembly area his staff chose for the second attempt took in precisely the ground Brown had chosen to search. Two armies had spent 3 weeks looking for each other across the Highlands and had finally agreed, without either of them knowing it, on a place. Nobody on either side knew that yet. On the evening of the 12th, visiting the battalion, the division's deputy commander for operations mentioned that he had no objection to sending a battalion in there. Moore set it down in his after-action report in one flat line. This we took as an alert and began a map study. That is how the decision arrived, not as an order from above, but as an absence of objection. The 13th was an ordinary day. The battalion patrolled a new area south and southwest of Play Me and found nothing. Late in the afternoon, the brigade commander came down to Company A's command post and gave the order face-to-face. An airmobile assault into the Ia Drang Valley, north of the Massif, early the next morning, searching and destroying through the 15th. Artillery would come from a clearing called Falcon, 9 kilometers east, 2 batteries of 105mm howitzers, one of them still to be flown in before the assault went, and one caution, offered rather than ordered. Keep the rifle companies within supporting distance of one another. Moore worked the problem into the night at his own command post, and by 10 o'clock everything had been done that could be done, without seeing the ground from the air. Then he went back to the map, where a red star northwest of the mountain marked a suspected base. On the previous days, he had put each rifle company into a separate clearing, which is standard and which spreads a battalion across kilometers of jungle. That night he changed it. One clearing, the whole battalion. If they ran into something, they would all be in the same place to meet it. What intelligence could give him fit into the corner of that map? A North Vietnamese battalion, perhaps 5 kilometers northwest of the landing ground. Another group, size unknown, probably just southwest of the clearing itself. A base somewhere within 3 kilometers. 3 soft marks, none of them confirmed. What it could not give him, the official history sets down in 3 words. Unknown to Colonel Moore, 2 battalions of the 66th Regiment and a composite battalion of the 33rd had already closed on Chu Pong and were sitting on the high ground above the clearing. As many as 1,600 men, with the 32nd Regiment and others behind them. They were ready to fight. The 14th of November dawned bright and clear. First light came at 6:30, and the sky was already full of noise. Chinooks bringing Company B back to Play Me, and the same Chinooks lifting a battery of howitzers forward to Falcon. The officers who were to fly the reconnaissance settled their arrangements on the strip, shouting at each other under a deafening roar of helicopters. The battalion commander, his operations officer, the artillery and aviation people, the assault company commander. They went up around 7 in 2 Hueys, with 2 gunships above them. One passed south to north at roughly 4,500 feet, on as far as Duc Co. 5 minutes in a circle there, and back down the same track at the same height. A compromise between seeing and being seen. What Moore wanted was the largest available clearing, one that would not unduly restrict the helicopters. There were 3 of them down there, and they were called Tango, Yankee, and X-Ray. Tango went out at once, walled in by tall trees, room for 3 or 4 ships at a time. Yankee and X-Ray each looked good for 8. He picked X-Ray provisionally and sent the scout section back out to fly the valley low, down among the treetops. They were gone about 40 minutes. Yankee, they reported, was studded with tall stumps, difficult and dangerous to use. X-Ray would take 8 to 10 ships. Nobody had fired at them. Several trails were seen and marked, and none of them ran through the clearing itself. And on a trail just north of X-Ray, running east and west, they had seen a communications wire. As one official account puts it, this last bit of intelligence was all Colonel Moore needed. The clearing was about 100 meters across from east to west, shaped roughly like a funnel, the mouth of it 90 meters wide and opening west onto a dry creek bed. A clearing about the size of a football field, and an entire battalion was to come through it. A few trees standing 100 feet at the edges, hazel-colored elephant grass anywhere from 1 foot to 5, ant hills the height of a standing man. If you had walked out into the middle of it, you would not have seen a man lying at the tree line, flat and open from the air. On the ground, as one history puts it carefully, X-Ray looked like something else entirely. Then there is the Arithmetic, and the Arithmetic is the real shape of that day. The brigade had 24 helicopters allotted to it for the 24 hours, and 2 other battalions took 4 apiece for supply and small moves. Moore had 16, and 16 was the number the whole plan would have to be built around. A Huey carries 8 riflemen in combat load. In the thin air of the Highlands, the engine loses power, and the honest number here was 5. 16 ships, 5 men each, would put something under 100 men into the clearing on the first wave, and the round trip out to Play Me and back ran as long as 30 minutes. Whatever those first men found, they would be dealing with it alone for half an hour. Moore made 3 decisions out of that. He would ride the lead aircraft himself, so that he could wave the assault off up to the last second. He would keep the command helicopters circling above the clearing with the fire support officers aboard, so that guns, gunships, and air could be called without a relay. And he would drop the standard drill in which the first troops down form a ring around the landing zone and hold it, a drill that assumes the rest of the battalion is right behind you. Instead, the first company would push outward into the country, and everyone landing after would be held at the center of the clearing as a striking force. The preparation was worked out to the second, 8 minutes onto Yankee and Tango as a deception, then 20 minutes onto X-Ray, and onto the Finger and the Draw coming down off the mountain to the northwest of it, then 30 seconds of rocket helicopters and the escort gunships passing just ahead of the transports, all of it ending 1 minute before the first skid touched grass. It would be, Moore said, a split-second affair. It was not. The howitzers going into Falcon were still being positioned at the last minute, the airlift having run late, and the guns did not open until 17 minutes past 10. So the first meeting of the 2 regular armies began behind schedule, because it takes longer than planned to fly a battery of guns 9 kilometers. Down on the strip at Play Me, 16 Hueys came off the ground in a storm of red dust, 4 flights of 4, and turned southwest at 2,000 feet. 2 kilometers out they let down toward the treetops. Ahead of them, the grass in the clearing was standing still. The rocket ships came through and pulled away. The escorting gunships went in just ahead of the transports with their door gunners firing into the trees. And the grass went flat under 16 sets of rotors. The time of the assault, the after-action report says, was precisely 10:48 in the morning. The men ran off the landing zone into the trees, firing into likely positions as they went, and nothing fired back. Whatever was in that valley had not been woken by the artillery, or had chosen not to answer it. Out of the lead ship with the battalion commander came his sergeant major, his intelligence officer, 2 radio operators, and a Montagnard interpreter sent up by brigade. A man the record names as Mr. Nick, who spoke good English. With them, 75 men of Company B. The helicopters were gone within a minute, back toward Play Me for the rest of the company. So began, in the language of the report, the shuttling of the battalion into the area of operations. Captain John Heron ran the plan. Made the night before exactly as written. One platoon pushed its squads 50 to 100 meters out in every direction. The rest of Company B stayed hidden in the trees and grass, near the middle of the clearing, ready to move. So there they stood, something under 100 men, a mountain above them, and a question one history puts in 3 words. Where was the enemy? Part of the answer walked up to them half an hour later. One of the reconnaissance squads came on a man in the brush 50 meters out. He tried to slip away and was taken without a shot. No weapon, a dirty khaki shirt and trousers, a serial number on one shoulder board, an empty canteen. That is the whole description in the document. Everything else about him comes from what he said. Moore went out to him with his intelligence officer and Mr. Nick, and the 3 of them worked through 3 languages in the elephant grass. The man said he had eaten nothing but bananas for 5 days, that he was a soldier of the North Vietnamese Army, and that there were 3 battalions on the mountain above who wanted very much to kill Americans, but had not been able to find any. What he was doing out there alone and unarmed, the report does not say. Moore called him a godsend because what he said fit in neatly with what the intelligence people had told them. He revealed nothing. He confirmed, and 3 soft marks on a map hardened into 3 battalions while he was still talking. 3 decisions came out of it at once. Company B was to push its reconnaissance toward the mountain, to be ready to take over Company C's mission and sweep the lower slopes, with the weight of it on the finger and the draw to the northwest, and the prisoner was to fly out at once on the command helicopter. Company A's commander asked for the job and was told no. It was Heron's, whose men were already on that ground, and Company A got the clearing to guard. By noon there was enough of Company A down to take the clearing off Company B's hands. The last men to land without a shot fired at them came in early in the afternoon. On the next lift, 16 ships went out and only 8 came in through the fire. Moore turned the rest back by radio. The battalion was complete around 3-6 turns of the carousel, better than 4 hours after the first skid touched grass. Everything at X-ray that afternoon happened to a battalion not yet assembled. A little after noon, the reconnaissance platoon met single riflemen at the foot of the mountain. Not a battle, a scatter of shots among the trees. Company B was told to take up the sweep, move up the finger toward the mountain, and develop the situation. At 12:30 it crossed its line of departure, the dry creek bed along the western edge, 2 platoons forward and 1 behind. Nothing was falling on the clearing yet. Then the ground took the company apart without anyone making a mistake. Low ground and the creek on the left, rising slope on the right, thick brush between. The lead platoon crossed the creek, drew ahead, and the two forward platoons lost sight of one another. At 1:45, that platoon was pinned by fire from both flanks. The guns could not help at first. No landmarks, brush and trees, the same in every direction. The air heavy with smoke and dust. So they walked the fire down the mountain in steps until it came near enough to matter. To take the weight off, Heron radioed his second platoon, under Lieutenant Herrick, to tie in with that platoon's right flank. Herrick could see enemy soldiers ahead and asked permission to go after them. He was given it with a warning: "Be careful, because I don't want you to get pinned down or sucked into anything." Minutes later, the platoon was gone. It went up after a squad it had seen on a trail, and by the time anyone below understood how far it had gone, it was on the crest of the finger 300 meters northwest of the clearing, in a circle 25 meters across, with the ground behind it belonging to somebody else. The report is precise about the cost to everyone else. A platoon separated in the jungle could not pinpoint its own location for close supporting fires, and being forward of two companies, it delayed effective fires in support of both. For the rest of the afternoon, the battalion's heaviest weapon could not be used freely on that side. At 1:30, Company B reported at least two companies attacking it, and its right platoon in danger of being cut off, and the first mortar rounds and rockets came down on the clearing. The original plan, Moore told Company A's commander, was out the window. Company A was to come up on Company B's left, make physical contact, cover that flank, and send one platoon toward the cut-off platoon. Company C was to block south and southwest inside the tree line. That left the north and east thin, and no reserve at all, and the risk was taken with open eyes. Around 2:00, Company A ran into at least a company of North Vietnamese coming up the dry creek bed, directly into Company B's left rear. That creek did 4 jobs in 6 hours: a line of departure in the morning, a road for the other side at midday, a trench in the afternoon, and a line of departure again at 4:20. Its banks were waist deep, and there was no water in it at all. On the mountain, the day had begun earlier and turned faster. Units due to attack Play Me again on the 16th had left their assembly areas at first light, and the landing was spotted at once. Within an hour, the design was reversed. Play Me was called off, and 2 regiments were ordered onto the clearing. They did not have to come down from the summit. They were already on the near slope, looking at it. Single riflemen a little after noon, 2 companies by 1:30. A battalion attack by the middle of the afternoon. The last company of the battalion came down in the middle of a firefight and lost 3 commanders in an hour. Minutes after Company C finished landing, 175 to 200 men came at it from the southwest and west, in helmets and well camouflaged, and Company C held them for something over an hour. By late afternoon, Moore reckoned 500 or 600 men against him, and those were only the ones he was in contact with. He asked brigade for another rifle company and was given one at once. 120 men who came in between 5 and 6. Twice that afternoon the battalion went out after them, and twice it came back short. Toward evening, the companies pulled back under covering fire to the edge of the clearing and dug a tight perimeter for the night. By 7, the units were tied in, and the defensive fires registered. Full dark came at 1:15, and 300 meters out on the finger, on a rise the size of a small yard, 27 men lay in grass with fire coming across it too low for most of them to dig. They had the mountain above them and the battalion behind them, and the whole of the night in front. By the time anyone down on the clearing understood what had happened to 2nd Platoon, it was already outside everything the battalion could reach. 27 men of B Company, 1st Battalion of the 7th Cavalry, under a 2nd Lieutenant named Henry Herrick. They went up the finger of the ridge a little after 1 o'clock, and they would spend the next 26 hours 300 meters from their own perimeter, a distance you could shout across, and no one could walk. The order that sent them up there was not an order to attack. At 1:45, the company's 1st Platoon had come onto a group of North Vietnamese soldiers at the foot of the slope and was pinned by fire from both flanks. Captain John Heron, commanding B Company, needed that pressure taken off and told Herrick to move right and tie in with 1st Platoon's exposed side. The ordinary business of an infantry company, one platoon reaching sideways to touch another. What followed was a sequence rather than a mistake. Moving in the direction he had been given, Herrick's lead scouts came onto a well-beaten trail, running parallel to their march, and on it a North Vietnamese squad, walking down toward the clearing. The squad turned and ran back up the path. The platoon went after it, firing, and came out on the crest of the finger perhaps at 100 meters above the dry creek bed. By then the ground behind them belonged to somebody else. Herrick meant to keep going with 3 squads on line and his machine guns out on the flanks. At that moment, his 3rd squad saw about 20 soldiers crossing toward 2 large anthills on the platoon's left and opened fire. The answer came back at once, and then a heavy volley from the right that pinned the whole squad where it lay. Within a few minutes, there was fire on the platoon from every direction. Herrick turned both of his machine guns toward the pinned squad and ordered its leader, Sergeant Clyde Savage, to bring his men back under their cover. The squad got in. One of the 2 gun crews got in. The other did not. 4 men, and the gun itself, which the North Vietnamese turned around and fired into the platoon for the rest of the night. What was left pulled into a rough circle 25 meters across on an open shoulder of the mountain in grass that stood chest high and hid anything willing to crawl. Herrick was hit in the middle of the afternoon, and he went on directing the defense of that small circle while he was dying. He handed his signal operating instructions, the book of call signs and radio frequencies, to Sergeant Carl Palmer, the platoon sergeant, with an order to burn it if the position was about to be overrun, and he left 3 instructions, in the order he believed they mattered: redistribute the ammunition, call for artillery, and break out toward the company if the chance came. Palmer, already lightly wounded, took over and was killed almost immediately. The leader of the 2nd squad raised himself onto his knees and said, to no one in particular, that he was going to get the platoon out of there. He finished the sentence. Command passed for the 3rd time in under an hour, and it passed to Sergeant Savage, who reached across the grass for the radio of the artillery reconnaissance sergeant lying beside him and began calling for fire. In his after-action report, Colonel Moore described him without using his name. The man who ended up on the radio was a Sergeant E5 squad leader, he wrote. He could not get to the ranking man, since any move he made drew immediate enemy rifle fire. He was the commo and leadership link to his company commander. That is the architecture of the night. One radio, one voice, a chain of command shortened to a single man lying in the grass. 9 kilometers away, on a bare hilltop, the division called Falcon, 2 batteries of the 1st Battalion 21st Artillery stood in the open with their howitzers. They could not see the mountain, and they could not see the platoon. What they had was Savage's voice describing the invisible. Where the footsteps were, where the voices were, how far up the slope the sound came from. And within minutes he had ringed the position with fire, some of it landing 20 meters out. 3 times that night, groups of roughly 50 men came at the little circle, and 3 times they were stopped by rifle fire and by the artillery. Several of the wounded went on shooting. Before the second attack, at about 3:45 in the morning, bugles sounded around the platoon and higher up the mountain, 200 to 400 meters above. Savage called down a 15-minute preparation and then an airstrike onto the slope directly overhead. In the gaps, there was the sound of the North Vietnamese moving their own men back, and voices near enough that he could hear the sing-song rhythm of the language. The platoon had 1 medic, and it had him by accident. Specialist 5. Charles Luce was B Company's senior aidman. Heron had attached him to 2nd Platoon that morning simply because the platoon was short. He spent the day and the night moving inside a perimeter 25 meters wide. And when the first aid packets ran out, and then the bandages in his own bag, he used the small packets of toilet paper that came in every ration box. Calm, sure, and thoroughly professional, the official history says of him. He brought reassurance to the men. Twice on the 14th, the battalion tried to reach them. The first attempt, made within minutes by the rest of B Company, got to within 75 meters and could go no further. The second, at 4:20 in the afternoon, went in with 2 companies on line behind a heavy artillery preparation. B Company advanced between 75 and 100 meters and took 30 casualties doing it. A company got about 150 meters and lost all 3 of its rifle platoon leaders. The North Vietnamese had worked forward to the creek bed itself, and they were in the trees, in holes, and in niches cut into the sides and tops of the anthills, in khaki that matched the dry grass exactly. Nothing about that ground could be taken by walking onto it. Moore's report puts the whole afternoon in one line. None fell back. For friendly to advance, the enemy had to be killed. At 6:20, with the light going, he ordered both companies back to the edge of the clearing. The reasoning is the same in his report and in the official history. The battalion was fighting 3 battles at once: the defense of the landing zone, the attack by 2 companies, and the isolated platoon. And going on meant risking all 3. The clearing was the key to everything. Pulling the companies back needed smoke, and there were no smoke shells on the gun line. So Moore remembered Korea and asked for white phosphorus instead. They fired a second volley, and both companies came out without losing a man. So the 27 stayed where they were, and the sun went down on them. They were reached at 3:10 the following afternoon, 26 hours after the trail. 8 of them were dead and 12 were wounded, and all of those losses had been taken on the first day, before Savage got on the radio. Through the whole night the platoon lost no one else, and it still had ammunition when the relief arrived. The official history lists the reasons they lasted: luck, an enemy who never understood how few of them there were, the skill of one medic, personal courage, and above all, one sergeant's handling of guns 9 kilometers away, 300 meters below them in the dark. The rest of the battalion was drawing a circle of its own. Down on the clearing, the same order that pulled the 2 companies back began something else. It was 6:20. The light was going, and the battalion had a little over an hour to turn a ragged line of contact into something that could be held from every side at once. Moore spent that time walking the edge and pushing units into place until the shape stopped being a line. His report records the finish without a spare word. By 1900 hours, the organization of the perimeter was completed. Units were tying in for the night, and defensive artillery and mortar fires were being registered. The circle that came out of it was not even. C Company had the longest stretch of it, the south and southeast. A company held a short piece facing west, its platoons lying in the dry creek bed, the only ready-made trench on the clearing. B Company held the north and northwest, out in front of the creek, with an average of 5 meters between one man's position and the next. D Company, the smallest in the battalion, held the entire eastern side. Between them stood a company that had landed in the last hour of daylight, between 5:05 and 6 o'clock, in packets of 2 and 4 helicopters. B Company of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry came in, 120 men, to cheering from the men already on the ground. Its commander, Captain Myron de Durick, stepped out of the lead ship, ran to the battalion commander and saluted. "Gary Owens, sir," he said. Within 2 hours, Moore had spent that company wherever the ring was thinnest. The command post stood where it had stood since morning, at a 10-foot ant hill and a stand of trees near the middle of the clearing. The dead were brought there and laid together, and somebody built a small light-proof space out of ponchos, so the medics could work by flashlight, the only man-made light inside the circle all night. C Company's line lay 125 meters east of that anthill, a command post and a fighting line 150 paces apart, with a whole battalion in between. Nothing was put outside the ring. Captain Edwards set no listening posts at all. The grass was too high for a man lying out front to see anything, and he meant to register his protective artillery within 100 meters of his own holes. Moore put the same judgment into his conclusions. In that terrain, outposts would have been suicidal. Inside the ring, the rules were as tight. The lights on the mortar aiming stakes were switched off. No mortar fired without the battalion commander's personal permission, and every fire mission went through one man. There were 3 ways to light that ground, in a strict order of preference. The Air Force flare ship, which orbited overhead all night waiting to be asked. Then artillery illumination, and last, mortar rounds, which failed often and of which 1 hour of steady light would have taken more than the battalion owned. They used light exactly once, at about 4 in the morning, to put an airstrike onto the slope above the cutoff platoon. The flare ship lit the mountain, and then it went out and stayed out. Light showed the men on the slope opposite exactly where the 27 were lying, and showed the open stretches of the battalion's own perimeter just as clearly. It also did something Moore wrote down afterward. Whenever illumination was in the air, many of the enemy ceased firing. That was the trade. Light bought quiet and sold your position. The moon came up at about 20 past 11 into a cloudless sky, and the rest of the night the circle was lit by the moon and the flash of its own shells. What came at them in the dark was not an attack. Groups of 5 to 10 men moved up in front of A and B companies, and at the seam between C and A, firing a little and waiting to see what answered. The point was not to break in, it was to make the Americans reply with automatic weapons, so the machine guns could be plotted for the morning. The men on the line did not take it. They answered with rifles and grenade launchers and left the machine guns quiet. In the whole night, the battalion took 6 or 7 mortar or rocket rounds. The only real look anyone got at the mountain came at the end of a landing approach. Captain Gregory Dillon, the operations officer, had spent the whole day airborne in the command ship, relaying radio traffic and carrying the artillery and air officers with him. At 9:30 that night, he brought 2 helicopters in from the south. Through smoke and dust that hung over the area, in Moore's phrase, like a horizontal curtain. On the way down, he saw 4 or 5 lights on the forward slopes of Chu Pong, hovering and wavering in the darkness. Minutes after he stepped off, those lights were grid coordinates. The guns were the 2 batteries on Falcon, and they never really stopped. All night they laid harassing and interdicting fire along the lower spurs and draws of the mountain, around the rim of the perimeter, and up the slopes where the lights had been. And at the same time, the ring around the isolated platoon. Between dusk and dawn, those 2 batteries fired more than 4,000 rounds. Moore turned the night into a rule. Where the other side is known to be there, the guns do not stop, whether or not anyone is attacking. For the men in the holes, it was a sound beyond the trees that never quite stopped. Everything that came in or went out used a patch of ground in the northeast corner of the clearing, big enough for 2 helicopters. Moore had chosen it in the early afternoon and wrote afterward simply, "This we had to defend at all costs. Every aircraft coming to X-ray called him first and was given its own heading, its own altitude, its own touchdown point, and its own way out. A Pathfinder team flew in that afternoon, blew a clean 2-ship pad out of the brush, and set out landing lights for night work. They were switched on almost never. A circle drawn in the dark, with a light switch nobody wanted to touch. Moore said plainly why the wounded moved the way they did. I did not call in med-evac helicopters too frequently because most of the afternoon the landing zone was under fire. He had arranged something else with Major Crandall instead. The wounded went out on the same transports that brought in the ammunition and water, flown by the same crews that had carried the battalion into the clearing that morning, from that pad 100 to 200 meters from the fighting line. Crandall flew 22 sorties on the 14th. Freeman made 14 separate evacuation flights and carried out around 30 seriously wounded men. Of those pilots, Moore wrote 5 words. They never refused to come in. By 7:15, when the dark closed, the day's accounting was finished, every wounded man flown out, the dead gathered at the command post, ammunition and water and rations moving out to the companies. Sometime in the early hours, the battalion commander and his sergeant major walked the perimeter together, stopping at positions, talking with the men in them. 2 figures going slowly around a ring a couple of 100 meters wide, checking that the companies were tied in. First light came at 6:30. 10 minutes later, Moore had his company commanders at C Company's post, where the ground they had failed to cross the day before showed clearest, and told each of them to send patrols out in front of the line and see what had come close in the night. The patrols went out at 10 minutes to 7, and they did not get far. 100 to 200 meters in front of their own holes, the patrols from C Company's 2 left platoons were fired on from the front and the left front, and began working their way back. Behind them, coming up through the chest-high grass, were men crouched low and in places on their hands and knees, camouflaged so well that for the first minutes the Americans fired at places where the grass moved. 2 or 3 companies had been forming up out there in the dark, and the patrols had found them too early. The weight came against the south and southeast, against C Company, which held the longest stretch of the ring. Then it stopped being one attack. At 7:15, a second came in against D Company on the northeast at the mortar positions. At 7:45, a third against A Company on the west. In less than half an hour, the official history says, the North Vietnamese commander committed 1,000 men against the clearing from 3 directions. By then, flat trajectory fire was crossing the whole clearing. Through the landing pad, the command post, the aid station, and 12 to 15 mortar or rocket rounds came down inside the circle within the hour. The enemy fire was so heavy, Moore wrote, that movement towards or within the sector resulted in more friendly casualties. That is what a critical hour is. A commander stops being able to move his own men inside his own perimeter. Edwards asked for the battalion reserve, and Moore refused him twice. He was not yet sure this was the main effort, and had been expecting the blow to fall on the cut-off platoon. What he sent instead was a platoon off a company's quiet side. 17 men, with 100-odd meters of open ground to cross. It took them nearly an hour and cost 2 killed and 2 wounded, and they lay down 15 meters behind C Company's line. They never attacked anything and were never meant to. They filled the space anyone breaking through would have crossed next. By then, C Company's own chain of command had run out. Edwards was hit and could not get up. He called his executive officer forward by radio, and Lieutenant Arrington was hit while Edwards was briefing him. There was no one left to send. For nearly 3 hours, the company was commanded by a man lying in the grass with a handset, shifting his platoons by voice, and in those 3 hours, it gave up nothing. At 8:05, Moore gave one order to the whole perimeter at once. Every platoon position on his signal was to throw a colored smoke grenade. For a minute or two, the circle became a visible object from the air. A ring of colored smoke on ground that from 1,000 feet looked exactly like every other piece of ground around it. Until then, the pilots and the observers overhead had been working from coordinates and description. Now they could see the outline. Moore put the method into his recommendations afterward, in the flat language of a man writing for whoever came next. On order, every position throws smoke, and the aircraft can find you. With the shape of the circle visible, the fire came into within 50 and 100 meters of the men on the line. 3 kinds of it working the same air at once, each on its own lane of approach. Guns, fighters, and rocket helicopters could be run together. The report concluded, without losing aircraft and without losing effect. The artillery history of the war describes what came of it in one phrase: a curtain of steel that broke the back of the attack. The men who were there would later describe something else about that morning. A code word going out over the radio, broken arrow, meaning an American unit in danger of being overrun, and every aircraft available sent to help it. The battalion did have an Air Force forward air controller, Lieutenant Charles Hastings, working beside the artillery officer. That much is in the record. The phrase is not. It appears in no document written that week, and the men who remembered it did not agree on which day it belonged to. What is in the documents is the smoke. There was a price for working that close, and Moore had reasoned it out beforehand. Fire support to be truly effective must be close in, he wrote. The commander cannot wait until he knows exactly where all his men are. Within minutes of the smoke going up, some of the artillery came down inside the perimeter, and an aircraft put 2 cans of napalm into the battalion command post area, not onto a rifle company on the line, into the middle of the circle, where the command group, The aid station and the ammunition were. The cans came down by the big ant hill. Stacked beside it was M16 ammunition, which caught and went off, and a pile of grenades, which did not. Men beat the fire out with whatever they had. The cost in the documents is 2 men wounded. The after-action report and the Army's air mobility history reached that number independently. A medic was killed at the command post about then, working on one of the wounded, killed by enemy fire, not by the napalm. No document names the aircraft. What was done about it took a few minutes and no argument. Captain Dillon ran out into the middle of the open clearing and spread a bright pink identification panel flat on the grass, so the aircraft could see exactly where the command post was. 3 weeks later, over his own signature, Moore wrote the sentence that closed the episode. This we accepted as abnormal, but not unexpected due to the emergency need for unusually close-in fire support. The price is named. The tone is level. Nobody is blamed. At 8 o'clock he spent his last reserve. The reconnaissance platoon went into the seam between D Company and C Company, where a mortar had been destroyed, and the landing pad itself was in danger. It cleared its ground, tied in, and from that moment that side of the circle was in hand. Minutes later, 3 fighters worked the North Vietnamese positions with napalm and bombs, and then came back and put cannon fire into ground 100 meters from the clearing. After that, the morning turned over. At 9:10, with the fire slack enough to risk it, helicopters began landing a company of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry. At 19 minutes to 10, de Durick took a platoon into C Company sector and assumed command there. Almost in the same minute, the attack stopped, and the North Vietnamese began pulling back. By 10 in the morning, the attack had been beaten. C Company had held, and nothing had come through its position. Of the 153 men C Company had brought in the day before, 42 were dead and 62 wounded. Since 8 that morning, another battalion had been walking toward them. The 2nd Battalion of the 5th Cavalry had been landed in a clearing called Victor, less than 3 kilometers southeast, and Lieutenant Colonel Tully brought it overland on foot. The brigade commander's reasoning was plain. I didn't relish the idea of moving a steady stream of helicopters into an LZ as hot as X-ray. 3 rifle companies, 2 forward and 1 behind, waited to the left because the mountain was on that side. 800 meters out, they were held up by automatic weapons in the trees, pushed through, and took 2 prisoners. The battalion closed at 12:05, 4 hours to cross 3 kilometers. At 1:15, the relief force went out to the slope. Herron's B Company on the right because it knew the way. 2 companies of the 5th Cavalry left and behind, all of it under Tully, moving behind artillery and rockets and air, the bursts walking along the flanks of the column the whole distance. 15 minutes later, every company still on the perimeter went out 300 meters as well, and for a few hours in the middle of the afternoon, the circle opened. They came to the 27 at 3:10, against almost no resistance. On the way, the lead men passed the machine gun the platoon had lost the day before, broken apart by shell fire. Tully did not stay to search the ground. He put 3 companies around the position while Herron organized carrying parties, 4 men and a poncho for each of the dead and for many of the wounded, and the force was back inside the perimeter in under an hour. The evening was quiet. Fresh companies took over stretches of the line and the older ones drew in behind them with shorter sectors to hold. Ammunition and water and rations came in. Every wounded man and every man who had died was flown out before dark. Out on the slopes, the artillery went on working steadily. And inside the circle, men who had been awake for 2 days began, without being told, to dig deeper. The helicopters lifting away to the north carried the day's wounded into something none of them could see from the clearing. A chain of hands that reached all the way back to the world. By the middle of the afternoon on the 15th, the clearing was quiet in a way it had not been since the first lift came in. The circle held its shape. The men from the slope were back inside it, and soldiers who had not slept in 2 nights sat down where they stood. What held that clearing together was never the fighting. It was a thin line that ran out of the valley and came back again, and had been running the whole time underneath everything else. Everything at X-ray arrived by air and left by air. No road was within reach, and the stream bed at the western edge was dry. Water, ammunition, radio batteries, a doctor, reinforcements, the wounded and the dead all moved on one thread, and the thread was made of the same machines going out and coming back. A helicopter that carried in cases of cartridges carried men out on the return leg. That was not improvisation. In November of 1965, it was, quietly, how the system held together. Where the helicopters took them, nobody on that clearing ever saw. The first place they went was not a hospital. It was the next clearing east, 9 kilometers away. The one with the guns on it. From LZ Falcon, a man moved back to one of the division's clearing stations, where the work was not surgery but sorting and blood and holding him steady. From there to a hospital at Pleiku, and if he needed more, onto the coast, to Quy Nhon or Nha Trang. Men who could be back on duty within about 2 months were treated in Japan rather than sent home. The numbers underneath that chain were new to the world. An evacuation flight averaged around 35 minutes, and a badly hurt man usually reached a hospital an hour or 2 after he was hit. Of those who reached a medical facility at all, roughly 97 in 100 lived. There is a quiet paradox in the figures. Hospital mortality ran a little higher than in Korea, because the helicopter now delivered men who in earlier wars would have died on the road. The name for that service came out of a book of spare words. In 1963, a major named Lloyd Spencer, whose medical detachment had no call sign of its own, drove into Saigon and came back with a list of unassigned ones. On dry ground, a helicopter settling into a field blew dust and blankets over everyone waiting there. And so the service that carried men out of those fields was called Dust Off. The name came from what the man on the ground saw coming. The division's own air ambulances were fewer than anyone would guess. Of 12 aircraft authorized to the platoon, 3 were forward for a reinforced brigade of nearly 3,000 men, in a campaign averaging 70 to 80 casualties a day. The transports carried most of them, because there was no other way it could be done. Early in the afternoon of the 14th, the battalion surgeon flew in with medical supplies, and 4 aid station men aboard an air ambulance, a medical helicopter carrying men into a fight rather than out of one, and set up beside the command post at the Big Ant Hill. The official medical history summed up that one flight in a sentence. It saved the lives of many soldiers who could not have survived a long wait for evacuation. 9 kilometers east, the guns had been in place since the 13th, lifted in a day ahead of the landing. Chinooks carried them, and a battery of 105s moved in 11 sorties, 11 trips, and in country with no roads, there was suddenly artillery Every shell they fired over that clearing had been lifted off the ground by hand. They were firing at ground they had never seen. Through the first day, the dust and smoke were thick enough that the observers could not tie the map to a landmark. And at night, the corrections came from a sergeant on a hillside 9 kilometers away, speaking quietly, working by sound. A second position went in later at LZ Columbus. And on the evening of the 18th, those crews would spend 3 hours fighting over open sites for their own patch of ground. Life for the infantry was made of very few objects. Moore had cut the load his men carried to 1 meal, a poncho, 2 canteens, salt tablets, and as much ammunition as a man could take. 2 canteens is about 2 liters in dry season heat, and the stream bed was dry. By midday there was nothing left to drink, and some men ate the jam out of their rations for the moisture in it. When Moore listed afterward what a battalion could not do without, rations were not on the list. Water was. The mail is best described by its absence. Letters came through an Army post office number in San Francisco and took about a week each way. Every man also had a date. The Army wrote it as DEROS, the date he was eligible to return from overseas, and the country on the far side of the ocean the soldiers called, simply, the world. A man in that valley lived by 3 clocks, a letter a week out and a week back, a tour counted in days he knew by heart, and an operating table 20 minutes away by air. And that is why the sound of them mattered. The machine stood on the ground for seconds, and the sound came up, paused, and went away again. A rhythm rather than an event. Not one of those aircraft was shot down in 3 days, and almost every one of them was hit. Out on the slope 300 meters away, the men who had been cut off heard those engines all night and through the next day, and none of them ever came. That is the other thing the sound was. Proof of a world that was very close and could not always be reached. Above all of it, for 3 days, stood the mountain. The mountain had been there the whole time. It stood over the clearing from the first morning, a long green massif rising into the haze. And everything that happened in that valley happened underneath it. On the evening of the 15th, the guns worked the approaches and the near slopes without stopping, and somewhere up in the dark, more than once, something on the mountain exploded on its own. By first light, the Americans were in a far better position than a day earlier. 4 artillery batteries were now within reach of the clearing, and tactical aircraft and the helicopter rocket batteries were on call. Moore had spent the evening tightening his circle. 1 company came off the line into reserve. Tully's battalion took the north and the east, and every company that stayed in place held a narrower piece of ground than before. Even so, the other side came 4 more times before dawn. The first sign was about 4 in the morning when movement in the grass set off illumination and trip flares 300 meters out, and between the flares the Americans heard high whistles, and that was how the North Vietnamese gathered and moved their units in the dark. At 22 minutes past 4, a platoon leader opened fire on roughly 300 soldiers coming up from the southeast, and they drew back. A second push came 10 minutes later, and the forward observers walked the 105s from one barrage line to another in 100-meter steps until it came apart. A third came an hour later, and a fourth as the light was coming up. At 5 minutes to 7, Moore ordered every man on the perimeter to fire into the trees and the grass around the clearing. It was called a mad minute, and it lasted about 2. 6 snipers came down out of the branches, and the shooting uncovered ahead of time the last attack being prepared. soldiers crawling toward the northern sector, still 150 meters out when they stood up and began firing, and were stopped there. The report notes something else about that minute, and it is a rare thing to find written down. The men liked it, not only for what it produced, but because it let out what the night had put into them. Then came an hour of quiet, and at 5 minutes to 10, Moore sent patrols 300 to 500 meters out in every direction. Only one company found anything worth calling a contact, and it cost 1 man. The survivors of the other side had gone north and west along the foot of the massif, back the way they had come in. Moore walked that ground himself. In his account of it, he used 2 words, a sobering sight, and then stopped, and did not describe it further. In his report, he turned the subject into an instruction for whoever would read it next. Troops must not get so concerned with casualties that they forget the enemy and their mission. That is what a man writes when he has decided that the only useful thing left to do with a morning like that one is to make it teach something. The mountain, meanwhile, had been answered. Late in the afternoon of the 15th, at 4 o'clock, 18 B-52 bombers came in without warning and struck the massif 6 kilometers west of the clearing. It was the first time strategic bombers had been used in support of a tactical operation that was still going on. The men in the valley were given no announcement of it. They felt the ground. The aircraft were not new to this war. They had flown their first Arc-Light mission over War Zone D about 5 months earlier. What was new was the purpose, a weapon built for the far end of a strategic map, turned onto a hillside a few kilometers from soldiers still in contact. The request for more went in that same evening, and the strikes continued until the 22nd. 96 sorties in all, close to 5,000 bombs across the massif, and the routes behind it. What they accomplished is honestly hard to say, and the histories admit it. What is documented is quieter. Prisoners taken during the campaign, and after it spoke of the fear those strikes produced. For years the mountain had been the safe side of the valley, the place where a unit could rest and be rebuilt, 8 miles from a border that made it safer still. The bombers took that away. On the ground, the 16th had one more piece of business. Late that morning, the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Cavalry, under Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade, walked in from LZ Columbus with a company of the 1st of the 5th, 5 kilometers through the grass, and reached the clearing about noon. At 5 minutes to 12, Moore began taking his own men out. By 3 in the afternoon, his battalion had been flown to Falcon, and the last of them reached Camp Holloway outside Pleiku at 6:30 that evening. The men stood ready in their loads, so the helicopters were on the ground for seconds each, and nobody fired at them. Men who had eaten breakfast on that clearing ate supper in another world. The accounting for X-ray is short, and it does not move. 79 Americans killed, 121 wounded, no one missing. The battalion brought out everyone it had taken in. At that point in the war, it was the largest single engagement that had been fought. The other column of that ledger was never agreed on. The report put the North Vietnamese dead at 634 by body count. The Army's own history settles for the sentence that can be defended, that the fight had reduced the fighting capacity of key units, which would need new soldiers and time to train them before they were whole again. Both sides wrote something down for themselves that week. The Americans put theirs in the battalion's report in plain language. The enemy sought to close in strength in order to render U.S. fire support less effective, and to force us to fight on his terms. The men who wrote it had spent 3 days watching artillery and aircraft do enormous work, and still finding people 25 meters from their holes. On the other side, the same observation became a method, and in the years afterward it was compressed into a phrase attributed to Nguyen Huan. Move in close to the column, take hold of their belts, and the guns and the aircraft lose most of their value. It was not a slogan. It was the conclusion of professional soldiers who had measured how much of the American advantage lived at a distance and had decided to fight from then on. Where that distance did not exist, some of the units that had fought at the clearing walked west across the border to be rebuilt. Others did not go anywhere. And on the evening of the 16th, 2 American battalions stayed out on X-ray for one more night. In a perimeter that other men had dug, they left the clearing on foot, and the reason was in the air above it. X-ray was to be evacuated so that the B-52s could put a strike down almost on top of the landing zone. And no helicopters had been allotted to carry 2 battalions away from it. So on the morning of the 17th of November, the men shouldered their packs and walked out into the grass. At 9, the 2 battalions went out together. The 2nd of the 5th Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel Robert Tully, and the 2nd of the 7th under Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade. Tully was bound northeast for LZ Columbus, 5 kilometers off, moving 2 companies abreast and 1 behind, with artillery walking its fire ahead of him. McDade was bound north for an open place on the map marked LZ Albany, and he moved in column, with a company under Captain George Forrest attached in place of 2 of his own. About 11 o'clock, 3 kilometers along, the column separated. Tully turned east and was inside the wire at Columbus 40 minutes later, in time for a hot meal. McDade turned north, then northwest, with 2 kilometers still to go. At the parting, Tully offered to hand over the artillery walking ahead of him, and McDade declined, on the grounds that the fire would announce where his battalion was. The history of the campaign records that without passing sentence, he assumed the guns would be there on call, and they were. But the method the other side used at Albany took most of their value away. McDade had commanded that battalion for 3 weeks, and he did not require his company commanders to hold a tactical march formation. He meant, he explained later, to push through to the objective rather than feel his way toward it. The ends of the column were careful anyway. At the head, Captain Joel Sugdinis kept his rifle platoons echelon behind his scouts. At the tail, Forrest arranged artillery support for his own company and put out flank security. The middle went differently, for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone's courage. Captain John Fesmire began in tactical formation, and as the heat came up and the grass rose over the heads of his platoon leaders, he put his platoons into column, which is what a company does when it can no longer see itself. The official history states the result without softening it. Significant portions of McDade's force were crossing enemy-held country in a formation that invited trouble. What the other side had left in that area was not large. A battalion of the 66th Regiment, a company assembled out of another regiment, and a headquarters element. That morning, General Mon ordered the battalion back to its regiment, and by midday its commander, Lo Sham Foy, had it in the trees northeast of Albany. When Colonel On received word that Americans were moving his way, he ordered Foy to attack, and Foy had about an hour to arrange it. He laid it out as an L, the long arm along the line of march, and the base across the open ground where the head of the column would come out. To fill it, he put in the cooks and the clerks of a regimental headquarters, and several of the porters who carried rice and ammunition. Albany itself was an irregular square 300 to 400 meters across, with a grove of trees at its center. The column was coming in from the east-southeast, through elephant grass higher than a man. Shortly before noon, the scouts took 2 prisoners, and nothing either of them said was of any use. Questioning them cost the battalion close to an hour, and along the column, men who had been pushing through the grass since morning sat down on their packs in the heat, and some of them slept. At 7 minutes past 1, the scouts came out onto the clearing, followed by 2 rifle platoons, the command group and the mortars. McDade halted the column and called his company commanders forward with their radio operators, so that 3 of them were walking away from their companies at once. A quarter of an hour later, the ambush opened along the whole length of the march, from the head of the column to somewhere near its middle. Foy had let them come within 40 meters before he did it. The column at that moment was more than 500 meters long, in grass through which one man could not see another at 20 paces. Formation could not be held, and orders could not be passed. And within minutes the units in the center had ceased to exist as organizations, not as men, but as bodies that could be commanded, reported to, or found. The head of the column held, the tail held. The distance between them was never closed, that day or that night. The commanders were where the halt had left them. 2 of them stayed at the clearing with McDade for the rest of the fight. Forrest went back down the column toward his company as soon as the first mortar rounds came in. Both of the radio operators who ran with him were killed on that stretch of ground, and he reached his company unhurt and took hold of it. At the head there were commanders, and at the tail there was a commander, and in the middle, through those hours, there were none. At the clearing, the men gathered around 3 termite mounds, and it was Sugdenis' executive officer, Lieutenant Larry Gwynn, who proposed using the triangle they made as the frame of a position. Over the next half hour, a coherent force was assembled inside it out of staff sections, scouts and men who came in out of the grass. The perimeter was too small for a helicopter to land in. Above them, Colonel Brown and his fire support officer, Captain Dudley Tatamy, flew back and forth trying to establish where the American units were, and could not find the middle of the column. Without that, nothing could be arranged, and Tatamy said so as plainly as it can be said. They kept flying back and forth, and they could not see a thing, and they could not do a thing. 2 batteries of 105 howitzers and a battery of 155s were within range. Observers were overhead. And in the artillery history's words, no one could fire at first. For several hours it was an infantry fight and nothing else. The first strikes came more than an hour in, aircraft and then guns, onto the concentrations forming against the perimeter at the clearing. For the center of the column they could do very little, because there the 2 sides were inside the same few meters of grass. In the end, fire was put onto that ground as well, because the alternative was to lose both perimeters. It was the hardest decision anybody made that day, and the men who made it said so plainly afterward. At 2:15, the Sky Raiders came up from Pleiku and worked the area for about 2 hours, and after that nothing further formed against either perimeter. By 6 in the evening the shooting had thinned to occasional rounds. A company flown in from Camp Holloway came down onto the perimeter at 6:30 without being fired on. Through the night, illumination aircraft held light over the area, and the guns on Columbus and Falcon fired into the ground between the two American positions. Patrols into the middle were refused. Men would lose their way in the dark or be shot at by their own. Wait until dawn became the phrase of that night. The one exception was a patrol that went out toward Voices and found about 20 men holding a small perimeter of their own. 4 were carried out on litters. About 10 walked back, and a medic stayed with the rest until morning. At first light, the firing had stopped because the other side had gone in the night. 2 companies walked into Albany without incident, and the work of bringing everyone in took 2 days. About 400 Americans had been in that column. 155 of them were killed, and 121 were wounded. 1 company out of the middle of the column came out with fewer than 20 men on their feet. On the other side, the figures were never established at all. What is known is that Lo Xuan Phuoc did not survive the fight he had arranged. Then Albany went quiet in a second way. The battalion's journal for those days went missing and was gone by 1967, and with it the document that would have answered most of the remaining questions. Sugdinis, who had been as far inside the fight as anyone, thought that nobody had won and nobody had lost, that both sides had been broken, and that each was grateful to still resemble a military organization when it was over. The valley was finished with them. The grass closed over the ground where the column had stopped, the way grass does, and the men who came out of it began a 4-day journey back to base by way of 3 staging fields. What the valley had cost was not yet a number. It would take a few weeks to become one, and a good deal longer than that for anyone to agree on it. The last of the collection work at Albany was finished on the 19th of November, and after that the valley had nothing further to give to either side. What was left was arithmetic, and it outlasted the fighting by many years. 234 Americans were killed in the Ia Drang, 79 of them at the landing zone called X-ray, across 3 days and 2 nights, and 155 at the clearing called Albany, in a single afternoon and the night that followed it. 2 clearings, 4 days. That is the whole of the number, and the honest way to carry it is to say plainly what it holds, and what it does not. It does not hold Play Me, or the ambush of the relief column on the road in October, or the 3 weeks of pursuit that pushed both armies toward the same river. It does not hold the attack on the fire base named Columbus on the evening of the 18th. Those men are counted in a larger ledger. The valley's own figure covers 2 pieces of open ground and nothing else. The wounded were never added up in any document that survives. The reports print 121 wounded from each of the 2 fights, and never add them together. More than 240 men were hurt in those 4 days and came out alive. Around the valley's number stands a larger one. The whole Highland campaign, 5 weeks of it, from the last week of October to the end of November, cost the 1st Cavalry Division 305 men killed. Take the valley out of that and 71 remain, spread across 5 weeks and 100 kilometers of high country. More than 3/4 of a whole campaign's dead fell in 4 days. On 2 clearings you could walk across in a few minutes. One number counts the valley. The other counts the campaign that carried both armies into it. The battalions came out of the Highlands in stages. Moore's men had gone by air on the 16th. What was left of McDade's battalion came out slowly and in pieces. From Albany to a clearing called Crooks, 11 kilometers to the northwest, on the 19th, a day and a night there. Then Camp Holloway. Then the division's base camp at An Kee on the 21st. 4 days and 3 stops between the ambush and the tents. At noon on the 20th, the 3rd Brigade was relieved. General Knowles had recommended pulling it back to An Kee for what he called a richly deserved breather, and General Kinnard agreed. Colonel William Lynch's 2nd Brigade, which had not yet been in the campaign at all, took over the Highlands. The 2 battalions of the 7th Cavalry went home with the brigade headquarters. The 2 battalions of the 5th Cavalry were signed over to Lynch and stayed in the field, which is to say that for a good many men the campaign simply continued. What a breather meant in practice was set down afterward by the division's artillery commander, without a single adjective in it. As each fresh brigade went in, the one it replaced came out with its own guns, went to a rest area, and was given the chance to bring itself back up to strength and to think about what had happened. Replacements, equipment, and time. And Khoi in the last week of November was red dust, tent lines, and rows of parked helicopters, and the calendar said the week before Thanksgiving. On the 26th, the campaign was formally declared over. 35 days, 5 days before the last of those men reached An Kee. The news had already arrived in Georgia. The 1st Cavalry Division had been built at Fort Benning out of the Experimental Air Assault Division, and Fort Benning stands against the city of Columbus, Georgia. The married men lived in post housing, in trailer courts, in cheap apartments along the roads out of town, and the core of the battalion had been together since the air assault testing years. The same sergeants, the same captains, families who had known each other for years before anyone had heard of the Ia Drang. So when a battalion took losses on that scale, they did not fall across a country. They fell across one city, and mostly across a few streets of it. There was no system for what happened next, because nothing on this scale had happened yet. The casualty telegrams came into Columbus over the Western Union wire, and Western Union had nobody to carry them. So the telegrams were handed to the drivers of the city's taxi company for delivery to the next of kin. The United States Army states this plainly in its own publications. The first of them went out on the 18th of November, which means that on that one day, 2 places called Columbus were inside the same story. In the Highlands, the last attack of the campaign was breaking against a fire base of that name, while the remnants of a battalion finished bringing in their dead. In Georgia, a yellow cab turned off a main road into a residential street and slowed down, looking for a house number. That was the part the people who lived there never stopped talking about. Not the telegram, the car. A taxi in those neighborhoods had exactly one errand, and everyone on the street understood what it was. And nobody knew whose door it belonged to until it stopped. Hal Moore's wife, Julia Compton Moore, was in that housing area while her husband was still in the valley. In the Army's own words, she followed in the wake of the deliveries, going to the widows, sitting with the wives, looking after the children, and afterward attending the funerals of every man killed under her husband's command, who was buried at Fort Benning. When she learned of one of those funerals from the television news rather than from anyone official, she arranged to be told about every telegram that came for the battalion, so that she could be there when it did. She was not doing it alone. The other officers' wives of the battalion worked the same streets in the same weeks. It has never been written down as an organization with a name and a roster, because it never was one. It was women in a garrison town deciding among themselves that nobody would open that door and then be left standing in it. The procedure changed soon afterward. The Army put together 2-man teams, an officer and a chaplain, to bring the news in person and to stay with the family. And that is how it has been done ever since. In the Second World War and in Korea, notification came by telegram. From Vietnam onward, it came by a man at the door with orders to remain. 40 years later, the Army created an award named for Julia Compton Moore, and its citation says outright that what she did after the Ia Drang changed the way the families of the dead are told. One last piece of the Valley's arithmetic took longer to close than anything else in it. At X-ray, there had been no missing at all. The after-action report disposes of the question in a single word. At Albany, 5 men were carried as missing when the first summary was written, and there they stayed through the winter and into the spring. In April of 1966, Hal Moore, by then commanding the brigade, went back into that country and led the search for them himself. He found them, and he brought them home. The Valley kept no one. The Valley kept no one, but it kept a conclusion, several of them, in fact, written down within days of the shooting stopping, at every level from the battalion up to Saigon. Each level wrote down something different, and the difference decided the next 10 years. What Moore wrote is neither a claim of victory nor an admission of defeat. It is a list of things the next commander ought to know. How close the guns have to come. How little of a fight a man can see from inside it. How a battalion holds a piece of ground it cannot see the edges of. In 23 pages, he claims nothing at all about the war. Above battalion level, the reading was faster and larger. Within days, General Kinnard claimed 3 things for the campaign: that the airmobile idea had passed its combat test with flying colors, that the division had stopped an attempt to cut South Vietnam in half along the road to the sea, and that it had destroyed the greater part of 3 regiments. On the 20th of November, American newspapers carried General Westmoreland's description of it as an unprecedented victory. The Army's own official history, written 30 years later, keeps part of that and sets the rest aside. There was no evidence then or afterward that Hanoi had a plan to cut the country in 2. What the division had done was slow, and then halt an attempt to dominate the Highlands. But at headquarters, the conclusion seemed plain: a first major fight against North Vietnamese regulars, one with X-ray as the model of a successful engagement. And very little time was spent on the ambiguities. Out of that reading came the shape of the years that followed. By the end of 1965, attrition was the guiding principle of American operations, and the destruction of the enemy's main force units was Westmoreland's stated ultimate objective. He had a term for the point at which it would begin to pay, the crossover point, where the other side's losses would start to outrun what it could replace. The goal for 1966 was to kill or wound more men in a year than could be brought down the trail and recruited in that same year. That kind of goal requires a number, and the number was the body count. It did not begin in the Ia Drang, and it did not begin with Westmoreland. The metric was in place before he took over the war, rooted in the statistical methods Secretary of Defense McNamara had brought to the Pentagon. And his formulation was as plain as it sounds. Things you can count, you ought to count. The count of the enemy dead was meant to measure the other side's losses in manpower, the figure that would show when the crossover point had arrived. The Valley supplied the first very large number. Why men believed in it is worth saying without irony. Westmoreland called statistics an imperfect gauge of progress, and then asked the question nobody could answer: In the absence of conventional front lines, how else do you measure it? General Dupuy said later that officers uncomfortable with the count used it anyway, because there seemed to be no other way to keep track. The assumption at the top was that the figures arriving on the desk were reasonably accurate. That assumption, rather than the figures, is what mattered. How the counting went in this valley is documented, and it is modest. At X-ray, the commander revised the number his own men had submitted, lowering it because the first figure struck him as too high. At Albany, in the words of the official history, nothing resembling an organized and accurate body count took place, and underneath sat a reason with nothing dishonest in it. The North Vietnamese carried their dead and wounded off the field under fire. A count taken on ground from which the bodies are being removed cannot be accurate. American records credit the campaign with just over 1,500 enemy dead by body count and roughly 2,000 more by estimate. More than half the final figure never counted at all. The official history notes that the numbers for 4 of the 5 major engagements are open to doubt. Vietnamese accounts published later differ by a wide margin, and no one has ever reconciled the two. On the other side of the line, the same kind of study was going on. General Tran Van Tra, who commanded in the South, described the problem afterward without bravado. At the beginning, they were forced to think and argue at length about the American intervention, because they were strong enough to face the Saigon army, but genuinely unsure whether they could face a modern army with sophisticated weapons. Then they took the first engagements apart, the way any staff would, and concluded that it could be managed. The Americans were superior logistically, in weapons, in all things, but their methods were largely conventional, and answers to conventional methods could be found. Losses accumulated over enough years would persuade American politicians that the war could not be won. Strategically, in their own words, it was a war of attrition. Tactically, they tried to destroy American units. The practical decision that followed was not to fight more often, but to fight less. General Mann took his regiments across the border into Cambodia to rebuild, and the Highland Front husbanded them well into 1966, coming out to meet the Americans only when it chose to. So both sides declared victory, and each had grounds. The Americans had held the ground they landed on, had inflicted losses many times their own by their own count, and had seen the airmobile idea work. The other side had met the American regular army in the field for the first time, and had not been destroyed by it, had learned that helicopters and air power produced no automatic result, and had taken the core of its regiments out intact. For an army whose object was not to win outright but to continue, lasting was winning. One side counted bodies and ground. The other counted time. The doctrine came out mostly confirmed. Air mobility had set a battalion down at the foot of the mountain without warning, in country with no roads, then kept it supplied and reinforced and carried its wounded away. But the same week showed the limits. Blades and engines wore out faster than parts arrived. Pilots wore out with them, and the division could barely sustain one brigade in the Highlands. And only by taking 1/6 of all the airlift in Vietnam to do it. When heavy fire kept the helicopters out, the men in the valley were on their own, fighting as light infantry on even terms. The officer who ran the airmobile program set the conclusion down in one sentence. Air mobility put a new dimension into ground warfare, but it did not change the nature of warfare itself, and it did not cancel the basic rules of survival that matter most to the individual soldier. If anything, he added, it is unforgiving of carelessness. The rest was scale. On the 23rd of November, 5 days after Albany, Westmoreland laid out the arithmetic that decided the next decade. The United States could add 7 maneuver battalions a quarter, and the other side could add 15. By January, the planning figure for the end of 1966 was more than 400,000 Americans and allies in the country. In November of the following year, McNamara wrote that there was no prospect of wearing the other side down faster than it could infiltrate and recruit. Westmoreland did not change his view. He could see no alternative. Air mobility itself stayed and grew and became simply how the American Army moved. The assumption underneath everything else was examined much later by Dupuy, who had helped build it. His biggest surprise, he said in 1979, and he had a great deal of company in it, was that the other side went on with the war despite the punishment it was taking. He had really believed that kind of pressure would make them break it off for a while, or give it up and go home. But I was completely wrong on that, he said. None of it was settled in the Ia Drang. By the time any of it was written down, the valley had been empty for weeks. Come back to the valley one last time, not to any date now. Just the place as it is today. It lies about 50 kilometers southwest of Pleiku, in the central highlands, where the ground runs west toward Cambodia. The mountain is still there. It is the one thing in the picture that has not changed. Everything at its foot has. The clearing where the first ships came down is a cassava field now, and around it, across that whole district, lie the plantations, coffee and rubber and pepper, hectare after hectare, worked by families of the Jarai, the mountain people whose country all of this was in the first place. Nothing at the site says what happened there. No marker, no fence, no path worn by visitors. A field, a road at the foot of the massif, and the mountain standing over it the way it stood over everything else. 28 years after the battle, 2 of the men who had been in that clearing went back to look for it. They found their way in with Moore's old army maps and a very old Boy Scout compass, and when they got there, the ground had almost nothing left to show them. The scars had almost disappeared. Galloway wrote, 28 years, it turns out, is about how long it takes grass to close a clearing. Waiting for them was the man who had commanded the other side of that fight. Nguyen Huan walked the ground with them for a day, where his battalions had come down off the slope, where the perimeter had been, what each of them had been thinking at 4 p.m. on a Sunday in November. At the end of the day, by their own account, they stood together on the clearing and prayed for the dead of both armies, and the Vietnamese general wept without hiding it. We were both trying to kill each other back in those days, Moore said afterward. But I went back to the Ia Drang Valley and made friends with him, and died in Hanoi 18 months later. They had gone back just in time. The rest of them lived long lives, most of them, and the country got around to its thanks slowly. The pilot who flew into that clearing when the medical helicopters would not receive the Medal of Honor 35 years afterward. His flight leader received it 41 years afterward, and only because he had quietly taken his own name off the list first, so that his wingman would not be passed over. The reporter was given a medal for valor 33 years late for carrying a wounded man out of the grass on the 15th of November. The sergeant major died in Columbus, Georgia, in his 90s, and was buried at the post cemetery at Fort Benning. His colonel was buried a few rows away 5 years later, next to Julia. The last of the pilots died this spring at 93. and there is now nobody left alive who landed in that clearing that morning as a young man. There is one more place where the valley is written down. On the Black Wall in Washington, the names are set in the order the men died, so that everyone lost on the same day stands shoulder to shoulder in the stone. All of that November is on a single panel, a few steps from where the list begins. One panel, holding both clearings, the men from the first and the men from the third day in adjoining lines, as close together on the wall as they were in the grass. And one of that November's names is not on the wall at all. Rick Rescorla, a young platoon leader out of Cornwall, came through the valley in 1965, and a war correspondent photographed him there with his bayonet fixed. The picture that ended up on the cover of the book, which he refused to read once he saw himself on it. 36 years later, he was the director of security for a company that filled 22 floors of the South Tower in New York. When the loudspeakers told everyone to stay at their desks, he ignored them, picked up a bullhorn, and started moving people down the stairs 2 by 2, the way he had been drilling them for years. Nearly everyone got out. He went back up. Let the whole of it settle now, the way dust settles on a field after the machines have gone. A plateau nobody had locked, and a valley running west into another country. An army that taught itself to fly and cut its own airfield out of the hillside with hand tools. 2 columns of men walking toward the same clearing from opposite ends of the world. One of them 4 months on foot down the trail to get there. 16 helicopters and half an hour to the circuit. 10:48 in the morning. 27 men on a slope in the dark, and a sergeant on a radio bringing the guns in close enough to touch. A morning when the circle held. A thread of helicopters running back from that clearing to a surgical table and on into the world. A mountain that answered. A column in the elephant grass that never closed up. A taxi driver in Georgia with a handful of telegrams. And a valley that, in the end, kept none of its missing. The grass came back over all of it within a single generation. It is the same grass. It is quiet there now. Sleep well.